This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. Today, we're welcoming Janet Sherlund to the show. Janet is the author of the brand new memoir, Abandoned at Birth, Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me. Janet shares some of her story with us, including her challenging relationship with her adoptive mother, her struggles with anxiety, and the reason she finally felt free to write her memoir. Before we get started, I want to personally invite you to join our Patreon adoptee community today over on adopteeson.com/community, which helps support you and also the show to support more adoptees around the world. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Janet Sherlund. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you, Haley. I love being here, and I really look forward to speaking with you.
I'd love it if you would start. Would you mind sharing a little of your story with us?
Sure. I was given up at birth, and I was adopted about a month later, 5 weeks later, was in foster care in between. Was raised in a family with 2 parents and 3 adopted siblings. So there were 4 of us, all adopted. And had the same experience that I think all the adoptees listening to this had, of that big black hole in me and the emptiness and the not understanding what was going on and what was wrong with me. And really thought about, I wondered who my birth mother was. I mean, every single day of my life. I cannot imagine a day that I didn't wonder where I came from, who I was, what was my story. I just knew it I knew from the get-go that I was adopted. We were never led to believe otherwise, but I just had this longing to know who she was and where I came from and who I looked like and what my ethnicity was. And it was there literally every day of my life. And I started studying about adoption in college when I took a class in early childhood development and found this was in the 70s, discovered that there are people writing about it and researching it and talking about it. But I didn't write my book until I'm now in my 60s. And although I wrote bits and pieces of it along the way, when something major happened, I'd write about it. But then I didn't know what to do with that. Or actually, more honestly, I was afraid to do something with it. I was afraid to write this book while my adoptive parents were alive. I didn't want to hurt them. And I don't think that's really why it turned out. It turned out that they both died while I was writing the book. But I really feel that was a big part of my hesitation in doing this earlier. It's like, well, how could I possibly publish a book and have them find out about it, or friends talk to them about it, or God forbid they read it. And so when people now talk to me about, I know an adoptee and they're fine, they don't care, and they don't want to search for the whole, the drill. And one of the things I always say is, you have no idea how much the fear of hurting the only families we have holds us back from looking at our truth and finding it. I said, that's really real. And so it took me until my 60s to really just be compelled to write this book and let it out.
Janet, do you wish you had done it sooner? Like, if you could take the courage you have now and pass it off to younger Janet, do you wish you had?
Oh my God, yes. There was the other thing about writing this book. I thought when I was writing it that I was just going to be telling a story that I had lived, and that, I thought I knew all the components. I thought about adoption every day. I read about and studied it. I did an independent study class in college on it. I wasn't a social worker, sociologist, or anything, but I talked about it. I read everything I could. I'd been in therapy my whole life. I thought I knew it. And when I started writing the book and had to write the book, I sent the first pieces to a retired book agent. And it was really more, was more prose. It was kind of poetry. My original intention was I want to try and capture the feeling of being adopted. I want people, first of all, I want to share that with other adoptees and say, you're not alone. And then I wanted people who just don't get it to get it. I wanted them to have that moment of aha, of feeling, to then take that emotional intelligence back to the conversations about it. So I was kind of just writing these moments that I thought captured that. And I just thought, well, I'll just string those together and people will get it. And the book agent said to me, no, we need to know your life. We need to hear the backstory. We need to know what your family was like and we need to put this in context and do this with you. And when my husband walked into the room after that phone call, I was crying. And he said, what's wrong? Didn't she like it? And I said, no, she loved it. But she told me I have to write a memoir and I don't want to go there. I don't want to do that. But I was finally convinced that was the context that I had to put it in. And so I did it. But so in writing the book, the knowledge of myself, I gathered, even though I had done all this other work before, was mind-boggling. And I thought, oh, God, I wish I had come to this earlier in life. I wish we'd had those conversations in my family about being adopted. And I wish the world understood it better. And I wish that I had understood my pain and grief and loss in a way that was beyond, the therapy and the reading and things. It was just a whole nother level. And yes, I really wish that I'd had this knowledge and was able to put it together earlier in life. I would have had a much freer life.
Interesting. That's an interesting choice of words. I had written a question for you in case this didn't come up naturally, but what it's like to speak freely now that people have passed. And so there you go. I guess the freedom is here.
It is.
Did you speak to your siblings who were all also adopted about being adopted?
My sister, yes. My brother, it was funny. Of course, back in the 50s and 60s when we were being raised, people just didn't talk about it. Like it just wasn't a thing. It was, and because maybe we were all adopted, it was the same reality for all of us. We knew we were. It was part of our bedtime story, how they went to the agency and picked us each up. And I was in second grade when we adopted my youngest sister. So I was part of that, that journey. I saw the social workers come and visit the house. I knew the whole drill, but no, we really didn't talk about it. But I was raised in a house where no one talked about anything. So, that just wasn't the way we were raised. But as we got older and after we left the house and as young adults, my sister and I would talk about adoption and being adopted. But it wasn't something I shared with anybody. And in fact, when I did say to friends things like, oh, I really wish could see who I looked like, or, and they just dismiss it. They'd say, oh, that's not important. I don't look like my parents, or, any that really necessary factor of being mirrored in the world, which we all have, and that we don't get as adoptees. Anyone I mentioned it to, and I didn't know anyone else was adopted, and I wasn't talking about it with my siblings, but they just dismissed it and made me feel stupid for asking it. Like, that's not important. I'm not like my parents. I have different interests and I look different. And what are you talking about? And it was a whole different level, of course, that I was talking about. And they were, if not seeing themselves reflected mirrored in their parents, they were seeing it probably in a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or a sibling. And there was no context for them to understand what I didn't have and what I was longing for.
So in your story, I saw this continuous need to prove yourself, right? So you said you had this independent study in university where you wrote about adoption. You sent it to the adoption agency. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I also made a note that it was in 2010, so only 14 years ago, that they still required an interview with you before they would the constant infantilizing of adoptees is so frustrating.
Yeah. And in New Jersey, where I was adopted and raised, my records are still sealed. I mean, I'm in my 60s. Both my adopted and birth parents are dead, but they're still sealed. God forbid I know who I am and where I came from. But I wrote when in college, I went to Colgate University, and when in college, I started finding all this literature and stuff about adoption and early childhood development that was so captivating to me. I asked the university to allow me for one of my classes to do an independent study in identity and adoption, and got an A+ on my paper and felt so validated. So when I wrote to the adoption agency, just really begging for any non-identifying information, I didn't even dare ask for identifying information, but non-identifying, I sent that paper to them to like try and, prove that I wasn't just some, crazy, lonely, maladjusted adoptee who was seeking to soothe themselves with some fantasy. It was like, look, I've studied this. I'm legit.
But they still didn't send your identifying information. No.
No, they still sent me a fantasy letter. That was 1977.
Okay, you say something I have never heard before, that the adoption agency that your adoptive parents used would present parents with their new baby in a certain way. Can you describe that?
Yeah, because I experienced that with my little sister. And so their original location was in this big old like Victorian house. And I think it was South Orange, New Jersey. And we all went to get my little sister, and we'd go in and they had this, big hallway with these tall ceilings and these ornate pocket doors, really heavy old pocket doors. And we're standing there, we're talking to the social worker, and I don't know, my parents are probably signing some papers or something. And then it was time to see the baby. And the social worker like pushes these big, heavy pocket doors to the side. And there's this this lovely like parlor room. There's this cradle with the tall bonnet, like the tall bonnet little like roof on it. And we all go up and the baby's lying there. And it was really a show. And here she is, your new baby. So that was.
I don't know why I fixated on that fact. I guess I never really thought about the handover, but just making this big show of the new infant you've purchased, it's just like,
yes,
there's something there. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely. Well, that was in the early 60s. So I think we adopted her in 61. And so there was still very much that sort of ownership, or that, that the children, the adoptees were, being passed from one person to another person. And, it was just a very odd kind of presentation. You're right.
Can you talk a little bit about your life growing up? I find it fascinating how we become so loyal to our adoptive parents in a way that can be completely detrimental to our own selves and our sense of identity. And you had a bit of a challenging relationship with your mom in particular.
Yeah, of course. There were four of us growing up, and it was kind of split 50-50 in the very textbook adoptee coping mechanisms that two of my siblings were hellions and just, pushed every boundary and tested every relationship. And two of us were the good kids, and I was the worst of them all in being, the good kid. I was so insecure and so afraid of I had such a need, I guess, to be wanted, that I just, I was just the good kid. I was also later found when I discovered more about who I was, that is part of me. That's sort of how I was born. But I just had this real need to please. And I had a wonderful father, who was just kind and generous and elevated everybody that he was around. And he was wonderful. But my mother she adopted four of us, but she did not like being a mother. She was a real achievement oriented, academic, and, had multiple degrees and taught. She was a mathematician. She was a math major. And she really should have discovered after one child that, oh, this isn't for me. But it was the 1950s/60s. And you had to have children. That was what, everyone did if they wanted to fit in. So they adopted four of us. And she wasn't warm. I never remember her hugging me and or any of us. And she was very judgmental, and she was just very achievement oriented. And we were just very different people. The things that I innately liked, the arts and visual things, she had no interest in or concept of. And, it's funny. So two people, two very close, my husband and my best friend, when they read the book, said, we didn't realize how sad you were. We didn't realize how sad your life had been. And I said, yeah, I kind of didn't either until I wrote the book. And I knew I was anxious as a child. And I knew there was something. I didn't think of myself as depressed, but I think sad. I knew there was that big black hole there. There was that big black hole in me every day, all the time. And I was just tuned into those feelings. Just like there are some people who are more introspective than others. I think I was just born like that. But whatever the reason, I was very much tuned into the, I would say, almost chemical stuff that happens in adoption. There's so many things that happen that we don't have words for. And there was just this level of, I think, grief and loss that just sat with me and lived with me. And I just had no word, and no one talked about that. I didn't know it. But when you're in your 60s and you're looking back and you're sort of putting it all together to put it in a book and tell that story, I mean, I can't believe that I lived with that every day of my life. It was really quite sad, to use the word again, and but it also freeing, in that it explained so much.
You mentioned earlier that you've been in therapy a lot. You've been studying adoption stuff for. Did you ever have like a moment where you're like, oh, this is because I'm adopted? We often use this like coming out of the fog or coming into adopted consciousness lingo. Did you experience that?
Yeah, there absolutely. And many times I had made the connections and thought about them, and even in therapy had these, real moments of enlightenment and connection. And so that's why writing the book surprised me. I thought I'd already had those things. I didn't feel like I was in the fog, but it was a whole nother level. And there's something that I think when I first started writing the book, I called it the blood calls. And that was a reference to a comment my housekeeper made the day I was going to meet my biological mother. But it was also, and then the publisher said, no, you can't do that. It sounds like a vampire novel. So that's why I changed the name. But the point I was trying to make is there's stuff that happens, I think, between human beings and in clans and families too, that we just don't understand or don't have words for. It's almost like we see it better in animals. There's an understanding of belonging. There's a biology to belonging. It's like when you finally meet blood kin and you feel this level of peace and comfort and connection, and you don't even know you can't answer 5 questions about them, but you feel this in your cells. It's almost like our cells can recognize that these are other cells like yours that have evolved through the ages. And there are feelings and understanding that we have in us that go beyond our consciousness, and that go beyond those aha moments. It's like you're in an ocean of stuff, and you're underneath the water, and there's all this stuff floating by you and stuff. And I don't know, it's just, I think of it when they talk about animals who recognize their babies in a field of identical young animals of their ilk, or, the way they talk about animals sensing our emotions and our feelings. And, we're animals too. There's something, I don't know what it is, but there's something about belonging. There's something about being with your blood. There is something that is just very primal, and we haven't figured it out yet. But I think one of the issues that we face as adoptees is that we suffer when that's taken from us, and no one understands it. They don't think it's a big deal. And it is such a big deal. And just to wrap but there are stories in the primal wound. Nancy tells a story of this child who's, in the hospital being treated for being burned all over and is crying out for its mother, but the mother was the one who burned him. And, you hear that story again and again, that children, even in abusive households, want to stay with that parent. And is it just a nurturing connection? I don't think so. They're not getting any nurturing in that family, but there's something that is compelling in us as human beings to stay with our own. And when that's broken, something real is broken.
Yes. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your reunion experiences?
No, not at all. I had 2 reunions. I met both my birth father and my birth mother, and they were the polar opposite. One was absolutely fantastic, and one was awful. When I went to my adoption agency, I discovered they were doing searches, and filled out the application and waited the year till they were gotten through all the other people. They found my mother, and turns out she lived like in the next town from me, but found my mother, and I was so excited, and she refused to meet me. Now, I was in my 50s and she was in her 70s, and hadn't lived in her hometown in 50 something years. She had moved away when she was first pregnant with me and never gone back. She was working outside the home. I mean, it was just like, it didn't make sense to me. What do you mean? You won't meet? No one has to know. We can meet for coffee. You work, but no, she refused to meet me. Didn't reflect well on her, she said. It's like, yeah, no kidding. This is reflecting worse on you. But so the agency said, well, we have the name of your birth father. Would you like us to reach out to him? I said, well, I never thought about my birth father, quite frankly. I had also been told in 1977 via that letter from the agency that you referenced that he didn't know I existed. So I thought, how's an old man who doesn't know I existed going to do anything for me? But then I thought about medical information. Maybe there was some medical information. So I said yes. And it was transformative. I mean, in finding out about me, his response was, if she's my blood, she's my daughter. I mean, we met in the moment we met, that big black hole filled up in me. And I couldn't answer 2 questions about the man, but it's again, that's one of those things. It's just so primal and cellular. And I was just home for the first time in my life. And it took 5 more years to meet my birth mother. Finally, my social worker I worked with had been saying the whole time, you need to reach out to your siblings. She has 5 other children, and you need to reach out to them. You're all adults. And I kept saying, no. They were raised by her. They wouldn't want me to interfere. I just didn't.
Because your mother had kept you a secret. None of them knew you.
Oh, yeah, they didn't. Oh, gosh, they didn't know anything about me. But I just thought they'd be like her. I don't know. I didn't want to do that. And then again, that back to being the good adopting parent, I realized at some point that I was saying, she'll be mad at me if I do. As the woman who was refusing to meet me for 5 years that I don't even know, and I don't want her to be mad at me. I mean, seriously, it's just amazing. So
that's really relatable, Janet, yeah. Just so you know.
I know. So I'm like, she won't be mad at me. Oh my God. So I write to them and, blow their minds. I overnighted this letter to all of them. I actually got mad reading Joan Didion's book, Blue Nights, because I was mad at the stuff she was saying about her then deceased adopted daughters being found. Anyway, and I love Joan Didion, but that really made me mad. So I wrote that letter. They got it all the same day. And the social worker's right. Finding my siblings was wonderful and really helped. I did eventually meet my birth mother because of their telling her she better stand up and do this. But she never wanted me in her life. And she was cold to the end. She really, rejected me in the end too. There was never a connection there. She just couldn't go there. And it was very, very painful. I will say that the fear that some adoptees have about searching is that they're going to face that second rejection or they're going to find something terrible. And that's true. But I wouldn't ever recommend someone not do it with that fear. I mean, if you are rejected by your parent, it is very painful. But if you recognize that and you understand that and you work through that, that's helpful. And if you find something you don't like like my birth mother is not a great person, it is disturbing to think that you could come from someone like that. But I think it's also a good cautionary tale. I think to be a really fully realized and at peace human being, you have to know the good, the bad, and ugly about yourself. And I could see traits in myself that she had full blown. As an adoptee, I could always look at something negative in myself and maybe pass it off as, oh, I'm just in a mood or that's something. And when you see those things full blown in someone you come from, I was like, oh man, don't let that in, like keep that at arm's length. So I would really urge people to search and to deal with whatever they find. And when you come out the other side, you will be stronger and happier for it.
Have you read The Girls Who Went Away or any of the other books on what mothers experienced when, they chose, quote unquote, or were forced to relinquish? I wonder if you've thought about that in context of your own mother, your own birth mother, like what impact losing you to adoption had on her. I think about that for my mother too, because I also experienced secondary rejection from her. And I don't know, I summon up a lot of grace for her. I don't know, reasons, I guess. But, I just, the impact losing a child can have on someone, I just wonder about that.
Yeah, I do wonder still. And I wish we'd been able to talk about that. But yes, I had read all those books before that. And even in my letters, so the way the agency did it is that you would write a letter to your birth parent and tell them, who you were, why you were looking for them, send them some pictures. And so it was, I see you laughing.
Okay. First of all, they made you do an interview first.
Yes.
And then you had to write this prescriptive letter that they had to approve and send before.
Yeah, they had to approve first and then they sent it to yes. It's very controlled. And so, I in that letter, I told her that I understood her, her feelings and that I didn't want to out her and that I understood to the best of my ability what she went through in the 1950s when she had me. And so I wasn't insensitive to that. She had gone on to have 5 other children. She was married within months of having me to a different man and had her first child there within 9 months of that. And so she had 5 more children. And it's interesting in talking to those siblings, she was a cold mother and all business. And we were all trying to figure out what happened to her, what went wrong? Was it different before? And I don't know because she didn't share those aspects of her life, even with her own children, the kept children. But it was interesting that in the adoption agency, the notes they had about her, she was very unusual for the women of her time. So this was an adoption agency dealing with lots of adoptees and birth parents. And she was a puzzle to them. She was in such denial. And she, just rejected me. I didn't want anything to do with you. You didn't want to see me. She said I wasn't even real to her. So she had an incredible level of denial coming into this experience. And I don't know what that's from. It's got to have impacted her. She was a young, vivacious, beautiful, popular woman in 1953 when she got pregnant. And, it has to have impacted her life. when she talked about her life looking back at it, I was born in 1954, she talks about what she was doing and doing that year. And there's no indication that along the way during that year she had a baby. I mean, she just completely wiped it out of her memory bank. So, I've read the books and I've tried to put myself in their shoes and understand the times and the judgment. I, watched the movies and all of that. It still seems that she had an extra dose of denial in her and she had her family life wasn't great. So I'm sure there were other issues along the way, but it's still hard to be on the receiving end of that.
I mean, you had two rough mom experiences. I was just looking at my notes from your book, and at one point your adoptive mother says, "I've always been grateful that Grandma Leaf treated you kids like you were real grandchildren."
Yes. Yeah, that was pretty horrendous. And I think I think without this more open conversation about the pain and trauma in adoption and educating, which I know now things have changed, and I think people are much more open about it and talking about it. But I think that also reflects my mother certainly, but I think also the thinking of at the time, and she didn't know any better. But I was so shocked to hear that. That was one of those life moments that you just sort of never get over. It's like, what? So my feelings are correct. I am not a real child. And there is a difference. And yeah, that's sort of nailed that for me.
So bringing that into your own motherhood, what was it like for you to have your boys and parent them? And I'm assuming wanting to do something a little differently for them.
Yeah, it's just a little different. I love being a mother. I have two boys and they're both great grown men now and in their own lives, but I love being a mother. I was a stay-at-home mom by my choice. I wouldn't have considered. I mean, this was back, they were both born in the 80s. And at that time there was a real status to being, a career woman and I think working girl, that movie. I think it was the thing to do was, have your own career. And that was really, but I just wanted to stay home and I wanted to be a full-time mother and I wanted to be the perfect mother, which of course I was not. I tried to be, and I wanted to be there. I wanted to respect them and who they were as individuals. And I just wanted to be there and be present and support them and be engaged and just made sure they felt loved and appreciated. But yeah, it was the opposite of my mother. This isn't in the book, but it's funny. One night when my oldest son was only like 15 months old, and Rick was traveling, and we lived in New Jersey. He was traveling to California on business, so he was far away. And this is before cell phones. It's the 80s, right? I become violently ill. It turns out I had kidney stone. I did not know, but I'm humble, and I'm in mortal pain. And I realize at like midnight that I have to go to the hospital, but I have my little, 15-month-old toddler upstairs in bed and no one. So I call across a neighbor and she comes over, and then another neighbor drives me to the hospital. But I call then I'm there and they figure out I have a kidney stone. They're going to admit me. So I call my mother and ask her to come and, take care of the baby for me. And she was really annoyed because I had just been down in that area. I had meetings down that way, and now I've come home, and now you want me to drive all the way back down there. And I'm like,
oh no.
Oh my God. So yeah, that was like, even as a grandmother, she just wasn't there. It wasn't her thing.
Did you ever talk to your boys about being adopted and what that was like for you?
Yeah, I'm sure I did. I can't remember a specific conversation, but they were very aware of it. And in fact, talked about it. My older son, especially as he grew older, and he said, but Mom, I want to know more about your family and like where we come from. And there was a real interest on his part to know more about himself that we didn't know through me.
Did they experience any of the reunion moments with you?
They weren't there for the reunion, but no one met my birth mother, but they all met my birth father and, interacted with them. And said my birth father and my oldest son are two peas in a pod. So that was really a special for him. I think that was really special to be able to see himself mirrored in that way.
Oh my goodness. So important. You share at multiple points in the book about your journey dealing with anxiety and panic attacks. Do you mind talking a little bit about that and how you've worked through it? And
yeah. To this day, I'm not sure I really understand the complete origin of that. I have to assume, based on what I've learned and with the doctors I've worked with over the years, that my body was born with this hair trigger of adrenaline. So that when I was, faced with an uncomfortable, anxiety-provoking situation, instead of, eking out a regular amount of adrenaline, it shot out this, huge amount of it. And then my body went into chaos and had all these strange symptoms. But I also believe, and have talked to therapists and doctors about this, that the fact that as an adoptee, I lived every day in a state of heightened anxiety. Like, I was never complete. I was never centered. I was always this big black emptiness in me. So I was living in a state of chronic anxiety. And that's exhausting. That wears all of us down. So you constantly wear down and put pressure on that adrenal system. And there must be something hormonal about it too, because, my first panic attack was that pre-adolescent age. And interestingly enough, then left me like after I had my children. So, but that was such a life-altering factor to have these full-blown, horrible, you thought you were dying or going crazy panic attacks from a young age. No one could explain them to me. No one told me what was going on. I don't know if they understood them back then. But it kept me so dependent on familiar people and familiar places. And it took away choice in my life. I couldn't choose to do things, go places, engage in ways that other kids my age, normal kids my age, were doing. And it really, throughout my whole life that I had them, so throughout from 12 to 30, or roughly that, I wasn't free to make choices. I was making choices based on avoiding panic attacks. And that's just such a waste of all those years. I wasn't free. I wasn't making choices out of free will. And when I did, I tried to push those boundaries, and I did. I wasn't homebound. I did push those boundaries, but I always paid for it. I always had panic attacks, and they were terrifying to go through, just terrifying. And I'm really glad that I finally found a doctor who understood what they were and helped me, prescribe some as needed beta blockers back in those days, and, got me through. And I luckily haven't suffered from them since then. But I think it was twofold. It wasn't just physical. There was that constant state of anxiety and chaos in me from being adopted that really fueled the hair trigger.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. I know that there's a lot of folks listening that have experienced panic attacks and anxiety as well.
They say, I've read things about how much more of a higher incidence there are of that in adoptees. And I don't have any data to back that up, but it really makes sense to me. So I think the one thing I'd say is, you're not crazy, and just find a doctor who knows how to help you and work with them, and you can get through it. But it's really scary.
Mm-hmm. All right. As we're wrapping up, I'm curious to know, are you involved in adoptee community? Do you have adoptee friends? Do you? Yeah,
no, it's funny. Not really. Yes, I have adoptee friends, and it's so wonderful to speak with someone else who knows what you're talking about. But I haven't been involved in the adoptee community. The one that's out there now and online and, in podcasts and posts, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see all those discussions and to hear people being so honest and to calling out to have our voices heard. That's very special. I avoided those during the 3 years I was writing the book because I didn't want to be influenced by someone else's story or journey or focus. So during those 3 years, that was a big chunk of the time. This has grown so large. And I just needed to listen to myself to write the book and to just tell my story. And now that the book's done and I'm talking to people, I'm putting my toes in those waters and discovering. And I think it's so wonderful. I mean, my gosh, I wish this had been around when I was young. It is the best thing. And my book was really written with two intentions. One was to really try and capture that experience for adoptees, to say, yes, you're not alone. But the other was to try and let people who don't get it glimpse the feeling. Because I think when you have a feeling, it's more powerful than words or data. I think it's, the Maya Angelou quote, people will forget what you did and what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I just wanted to try and get people to feel this for a moment so that they could bring that consciousness and that intelligence to the decisions they were making on political issues, to adoptee rights, to the donor conceived individuals, to international adoption, to reproductive rights. I mean, think about these things and think about them from the individual's perspective, not the birth parent or the adoptive parent, but the person whose life is really impacted by this. And so the sharing of these conversations going around everywhere, I'm very interested in now and tuning into as many as I can. And I'm so happy to see them taking place.
Well, welcome in. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Janet's book is called Abandoned at Birth, Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me. And what I really love is you don't pull any punches. You talk, you're sharing your story, and then you overlay constantly, like, a lot of adoptees struggle with this, and this, like, you're giving those facts all the way through, which is so helpful for people who aren't adopted and don't get it, which makes sense from what you just explained to us. And I read it in one sitting. I was captivated. I wanted to know what happened. And I think that folks will really be interested in hearing your whole story. And really, a lot of us will relate to many things that happen in your life. And it was just a pleasure to get to know you through your book. How does that feel to know people are going to read it and be like, whoa, I really know Janet now?
It's a very vulnerable feeling. It's one thing to write a book. It's another thing to talk about your book and face to face with people. And I was very unsettled ever since I realized I was actually going to get this published. I've been very unsettled. I felt very vulnerable. But I also know that everyone seems very interested in it and the topic, and people who don't understand it seem to be going sort of like, oh, okay. And that was the point of it. And so I always think the more personal we get, the more universal we become. And I hope that that achieves that in a few places, at least in the book. But yes, I do. It is a little uncomfortable to feel all the I was very candid in the book.
Yes, deeply personal and very easy to connect with you. And as an adoptee, to see those things pointed out that a lot of our listeners will totally get, but a lot of folks who have no concept of what it's like to be adopted will really learn a lot from them. I also wanted to mention, by the time this airs, this book is going to be in the world, but Gretchen Cizon has a brand new book called Relinquished: The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood, which is such an important book. It's so well written. I've followed Gretchen's research for a number of years, and she really talks about reproductive justice. And there's this fallacy that folks are choosing between abortion and adoption, when she proves that's not the case. And it's very interesting, very timely, and I hope folks will read it. It's, it's so timely. Excellent research from Gretchen.
Good. I will read that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. It's wonderful. What did you want to recommend to us today, Janet?
I'm reading as many books on adoption as I can get my hands on. Always have. I keep going back to The Primal Wound. Every time I read that, I see something new, see something different. I don't know how Nancy did that, but she got it. That book, when I read that book for the first time, it made me uncomfortable. It was so honest and so truthful, and it just shook me to my core. And I keep going back to it. I just think it's brilliant, and I haven't seen it trumped yet, I must say. And I know there are all the other, big Bibles out there and standards of adoption work. And there's I think I've enjoyed every book I've read, but for me, that's the gold.
That's the one. All right. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and your insights. I'd love it if you would share how folks can connect with you online.
Thank you. I have an Instagram at Janet Sherlund Official, and my website is abandonatbirthbook.com, or you can, the same site, janetsherlund.com will get you to the same site.
Okay, perfect. I know folks are going to enjoy reading your book, and thank you. Thank you for writing it and having more adoptee work in the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Haley, for all you're doing for all of us in this world. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I hope you do take me up on my offer to join our Patreon community. We have so many amazing events, and sometimes we're recording kind of far out, and so I can't always tell you about them live on the show. But if you go to adopteeson.com/calendar, you can see all of our upcoming events, and it's updated regularly with new book club events, new Ask an Adoptee Therapist events, our off-script parties with Pam Cordano. We have so many opportunities for you. And another thing we've been doing are some writing workshops. So it's pretty good value, in my opinion, for all the things you get. Plus, you get our weekly Adoptees Off Script podcast. So I would love to have you join. Your support helps keep this podcast going, and it's also helping fund the work for the brand new show that I'm working on behind the scenes. So I would love it if you would please join adopteeson.com/community. I'd love to have you. And if you want to just try it out, there's a free trial. So you can check it out, poke around, and see if you feel like you want to hang out with us, which I'm sure you will. And give it a try. I'd love to have you and get to know you over there. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again very soon.